Okay, so today we're going to take a little break in the narrative about slavery in the antebellum South as well as antebellum North to look at a concept that isn't necessarily new, but maybe is newly named, which is manifest destiny. And manifest destiny is going to follow chapter 29 in your textbooks. And the main question I'm going to pull up here is this one: Why were Americans so determined to push westward? Okay, now if you have half a brain, you're probably saying to yourself, this is not a new question. Americans have been trying and determined to push westward ever since literally landing at Jamestown and Plymouth. There's been a constant pressure and drive to move west. But when we get to the mid 19th century, the reasons why Americans are moving west is a little bit different, and the area in which they're moving west is also a little bit different. Your textbook, this is a great map here showing kind of the expansion of U.S. territory. This is, of course, a very, very small graphic, but when we're talking about westward migration, we're talking west of the Mississippi River. So this is the Mississippi River here. The Missouri, of course, will branch off. That's what Lewis and Clark explored, but we're talking about west kind of you know the of course the Mississippi River, and then driving through the new states of Texas, the American Southwest, and the Pacific Northwest. So America is going to expand greatly, double the size of its land mass as a result of this expansion, and the modern day nation, the modern day boundaries that hold the United States are going to be more or less set into stone as a result of this westward track. I'm going to pull up here a painting, and this will kind of serve as our backdrop for the first couple of sections here. And this is known as American Progress by John Gast, and this was painted in 1872. And you can do a whole painting analysis of this, but usually this painting serves as the preeminent picture of manifest destiny. I actually have another picture here, which I have temporarily forgot the name of, but still you see these kind of super romanticized images of westward progress, and just progress in general as shown by cities and plowing and trains and telegraph and school, overshadowing the wild American landscape, mountains and buffalo and Native Americans and wild animals. Of course, this is being led by prospectors and hunters and trappers and all that sort of stuff. So anyway, I'm going to leave this open for a little bit while we discuss manifest destiny, where it came from, and how it happened. First of all, the term manifest destiny comes from a newspaper editor by the name of John O. Sullivan, and he coined this term in 1845 to capture the spirit of nationalism that swept the nation as a result of exploring the Louisiana Purchase. As your textbook mentions, there's a lot of optimism, a lot of excitement about pushing westward. This had actually been the case for quite some time. Really, if you think all the way back to at the end of the French and Indian War, when Americans who were British subjects at that time finally thought to themselves, hey, we're going to get to go west now. We're going to get to go past the Appalachian Mountains. And that was quickly shut down by the proclamation of 1763 by Mr. King George III. So anyway, the optimism has stayed in progress, kind of throughout the last part of the 18th and through the middle of the 19th centuries. Many motives for moving west. We kind of divide them into three different categories. The first is religious motives, second is economic motives, and third is cultural and racial motives based on superiority. The religious motives. Well, first there's the idea that westward migration is coupled with the fact that God Himself has blessed the growth of the American nation. And manifest destiny is often shrouded in religious imagery. Here we see a picture of an angel, right, or an angelic being laying the telegraph lines of progress across the nation. So the idea that the Christian God has supported a westward track migration, this is going to be linked in very, very strongly in the mid-19th century. American missionaries are concerned with saving the souls of Native Americans as well. Native Americans have been cast for quite some time in the role of the noble savage. And now it's going to seem as a noble enterprise to educate native peoples in the scriptures, the biblical scriptures, and hopefully convert them to Protestant Christianity. This will be very different than the conversions by early Spanish missionaries into Catholicism. Economic motives, of course, the desire for more land is driving this more than any other economic motive. Also, there's a desire to get in on the fur trade that specifically that's been happening in the Pacific Northwest, which we'll talk about when we get to the Oregon Territory. Also, finally, gold will be discovered in California in 1848, so there'll be a massive surge of immigrants looking to strike it rich, and the kind of the mining culture, the mining boom of American history will be born. Lastly, the third kind of section of motives will be cultural and racial. Native Americans, though they're trying to be converted to Christianity, are seen as inferior culturally and racially. Hispanics that are in Texas and California ports are seen as backwards. And so there's this cultural drive to eradicate all inferior cultures, a racial separation between the enlightened and Christianized whites in the East and the backward Tejanos and Native American tribes and the Mexicans in the West. Also, there's a desire to spread Southern slave and cotton culture westward, which will, of course, get the United States in trouble as we try to make sense of adding more and more slave states or trying to balance the equation between slave and free. And this will also kind of keep us separated in sectional interests. Area that we're going to talk about in terms of American expansion in the Southwest is going to be Texas. And of course, another name for Texas at the time is Lone Star Republic. And this is because Texas was actually its independent country, as many Texans like to point out, for about 9 years. It was actually very sparsely populated when Spain granted independence to Mexico in 1821. Mexico is an independent nation. Remember this at the time of what's the word? The time of the founding of Texas. There we go. And the Spanish are gone. They're out. Mexico is its own independent country. The first American to settle Texas, though, is going to be Stephen Austin. He brings 300 families to form a buffer zone between Mexico and the Comanche tribe. The Comanche tribe, all right, I would love to teach like the Comanche tribe for about a week and a half. And there's actually a great book known as The Empire of the Summer Moon. If you'd like to read anything about the Comanche Nation, I would get that book. But the Comanche Nation basically governed a set of territory more or less ranging from kind of halfway down through the middle area of Texas, all the way up through the Texas Panhandle, Oklahoma, eastern Colorado, eastern New Mexico, and down into Texas. The Comanche Nation was enormous, and they're, of course, a very, very advanced, militaristic, horse mounted war tribe, and they're just complete badasses. Incredible exploits of war, lots of kidnappings, lots of killings. We kind of base our modern perception of Native American tribes on the Comanches, and some of the stereotypes are true, and some of them are completely false. Anyway, don't have time to get into all of that. But initially, the Texans that settle here in East Texas are really trying to form a buffer zone between Mexico down here and the Comanches over here to the United States. But not many families go in, as you can imagine. It's pretty unsafe. American settlers are expected to become Mexican. They're not expected to become American. This is Mexican land. They're also forced to become Catholic by law. So there's a lot of cultural dissonance between what they come from in America and this new Mexican Texan culture that they're supposed to more or less assimilate into. Also, slavery is outlawed in this Texas territory, and all these Texans are not expected to bring slaves into this area. Mexico outlaws slavery in 1829, so there was no sense that Texas would be a slave state or even a state at all, which is, of course, going to be completely abandoned as we move closer to the Civil War. Now, as you can imagine, conflict develops between Texans, and the Mexican government, especially as they're trying to assimilate in culture. What happens is Stephen Austin ends up going to Mexico City in 1833 to negotiate with the Mexican dictator Santa Anna. He's thrown in jail. During the 18 months that Austin's in jail, relations deteriorate, and war breaks out between Santa Anna's troops and a ragtag group of Texas revolutionaries. So we get war, and it's actually a pretty quick war. First, though, America has dealt a devastating blow at the Alamo in 1836. I'll go back to the guided notes. Here's a restructuring of the Alamo. Alamo's been destroyed, by the way, so this is kind of like a replica of sorts. But what happens is Santa Anna, the dictator of Mexico, ends up marching on this mission, this church more or less outside of modern-day San Antonio. If there's 5,000 troops, and they basically put the mission under siege for 13 days. There are 187 Texans in the mission, so vastly outnumbered. And what happens is all of them end up dying, and they kind of hold out to the very last man. And some major American heroes are killed here, including William Travis, Jim Bowie, of which the Bowie knife is named after, and Davy Crockett. So they're all killed there. It doesn't stop the fighting in Texas. If anything, there's a rallying cry around which many Texan Americans can come and fight with. And remember, the Alamo, of course, will be a major battle cry as Texans fight against Mexicans. And by May 1836, Sam Houston, the new military commander, will defeat Santa Anna's forces. And as it says in this map, Texas gains independence. Now, also inhabiting this area is a group of people known as the Tejanos. The Tejanos are Spanish-speaking settlers of Texas, all right? So there's kind of like part of this hybrid race between Mexicans, Spanish, and Native Americans. And they support the Texan Revolution. They support breaking away from Mexico. They fight side by side with Houston's troops. But many of the new Texans who are flooding into this new Lone Star Republic cannot tell the difference between the Tejanos and Mexicans, and so either end up fighting them or excluding them completely from the new government. Texas will remain an independent country for 9 years, even though most Texan Americans want to be a part of the U.S. They're afraid of being recaptured by Mexico. But Andrew Jackson, who's president at the time, actually on the way out, delays the absorption of Texas into the Union because he doesn't want to admit another slave state and stir up the sectional issue of slavery. So he'll kind of kick it down to the next presidents, and actually it won't be fully annexed, once again, as this map shows, until 1845. Now, the next area we're going to talk about is Oregon, okay, and this is termed the 5440 or Fight Saga. Now, the Oregon Territory was initially settled by the British and then the Americans. Actually, remember, one of the things that we read early on this class talked about that Nootka territory, right? And there was this fur trading debate between Britain or Spain. Anyway, in the 19th century, though, Spanish have given up all their claims in this area. And so it's kind of disputed between the U.S. and the British. And as you can see in this map, the United States is claiming this extreme high line at 54 degrees 40 minutes, right? Alaska is, of course, owned by the Russians at this point. And Mexico has all this territory up to the 42nd parallel, which is the extreme British claim, right? The United States has everything heading over to the Continental Divide. And of course, Lewis and Clark had come down the Snake and Columbia rivers down to the coast of the Pacific. So Lewis and Clark have been here, but the disputed area is going to be all the way through here, and really over where we should draw this line, separating British territory from the United States. It's under dispute because the southern boundary was never settled on. Back even all the way dating back to the Revolutionary War, there's no sense of settling the Pacific Northwest. They barely got people out of the forts in the Ohio River area. Compromise is going to be needed to avoid another armed conflict with Great Britain, and this time that could truly be a problem. Great Britain, of course, still has the best navy in the world, and the United States, cannot risk fighting a battle with a power as great as Great Britain. Sure, they can beat up on Mexico and Texas, but Britain's a whole different animal, even though the British would be fighting half a world away. Um, During this time, though, what's happening is a mass migration of American families across the United States on what we call the Oregon Trail. Now, a lot of you young guys have never played the Oregon Trail video game, or maybe you haven't seen the initial version. I, of course, as a millennial, grew up on that, so we're very familiar with the Oregon Trail story, and well, we're very familiar with a certain type of story. But the trip, as the video game shows, was very long and arduous. It took families traveling in caravans, in Conestoga wagons, actually, almost all of their money and in about 6 months to get from St. Louis to the Willamette Valley out here. There's a Willamette River right here, a very fertile valley, by the way. 6 months. And they would usually arrive completely broke. And the draw, though, was that once you're out here, you have access to very, very fertile farming areas, and so it drew enormous amounts of settlers. I think close to, definitely in the tens of thousands. I'd actually get an actual line, but the idea was if they could get out in here and settle in the Willamette Valley, it would be so great to settle up here, even though the coast is very, very mountainous, but the interior is at least somewhat farmable. So the Oregon Trail in this area was supposed to be opened, and the United States was claiming that they could go all the way up to the 5440 line. Now, in the 1844 election, we're finally going to see this issue kind of, trying to be settled. I'm going to pull up some of the stats here. The elections from November 1st, December 4th, 1844, and what we see is two candidates, James K. Polk and Henry Clay. Now, Henry Clay has been running for president for a while now. Remember, 20 years ago, he signs the corrupt bargain and becomes Secretary of State, which he was hoping it would be the stepping stone to the presidency. Of course, Andrew Jackson kind of ruins that for him. Jackson wins in 28, 32, and then Martin Van Buren wins in 36, which is more or less Jackson's successor. Now, Henry Clay has to also kind of switch party identifications. He's part of a new party known as the Whigs, and we'll get into where the Whigs came from in a little bit. But Henry Clay is the favorite here. James K. Polk is a relative unknown from Tennessee, but Polk is very good at using manifest destiny to his benefit and calling for expansion into Texas, California, and the entire Oregon Territory. And this is quite useful at this time to the American consciousness, right? He's able to pool a lot of votes. So much so that he is able to garner almost the entire western frontier vote, right? Every western state is going to end up voting for Polk because their interests are to continue to move westward. So Polk wins, not by much, at least in terms of popular vote, only 39,000 votes out of 2.5 million or so. It basically is a mandate from the people to keep spreading west. And this is going to culminate into the Mexican-American War. Before I jump to there, though, Oregon ends up being split. There's a compromise. Polk is willing to compromise. He can't fight Mexico and Britain at the same time. We'll talk about the Mexican War, another Mexican War that's coming up. So we end up splitting it here at the 49th parallel, which is going to end up being the actual border that we have today, right? And it's going to mark the border between Canada and the United States even today. Imagine if it was all the way up here. The United States would be way bigger, way, way, way bigger. Who knows if it would have just reached to the Continental Divide. But still, this would have been obviously one or two more states, a giant, giant section of land that we never ended up getting. We could have, though. Okay, the big event of this chapter is going to be the Mexican-American War that took place between 1846 and 1848. And this is an enormously profitable war for the United States. And we're going to go over why this whole thing happened. Now, the Mexican reaction to admitting Texas to the Union is that they're outraged. They realize that they can never get Texas back if, it was actually admitted to the Union. So, and this is further exacerbated by the fact that the border was never actually settled on. Now, this map is a little bit hard to see. But the Mexicans want the Texan borders to be the Nueces River, right? So there's the Nueces River that goes down kind of through Corpus Christi and out. But Americans say, no, it's all the way down to the Rio Grande. Now you might be saying, well, that's not much territory between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. And it's not, but consider if you extend the Rio Grande all the way out. Well, there you go. Now it's all the way into New Mexico territory, right? So, this disputed territory, this kind of like beigey orange color, that's how much territory is in dispute north of Mexico, okay? Um, you know, and Americans are going to be very, very forthright about coming down and claiming this territory for the American country. Now, President Polk's true goal in his dealings with Mexico is to get the ports of California over here, right? So San Francisco, Santa Barbara, Los Angeles, San Diego, right? He wants all of these ports to be able to trade with the Far East. And he actually tries to buy Texas all the way to the Rio Grande for Texas, Rio Grande, New Mexico, and California for $30 million. Now, this is an emissary sent by the name of John Slidell, and once again the Mexicans are outraged. They did not even receive John Slidell or hear his offer, so he's completely rejected. They don't even begin to talk. Now, as a response, what happens? Well, General Zachary Taylor, all right, which is this guy right here, Zachary Taylor, all right, is going to just go ahead and cross the Nueces River, and he's going to march down his troops to the Rio Grande and kind of start a fight. Okay, zoom this in a little bit. He's going to start a fight. You can see this. There's Taylor's name right there. So cross Nueces River and start a fight. And this is seen as an act of war by Mexicans. And what Mexicans do is they fire on Taylor, seeing as that he's technically, in their eyes, on Mexican soil. Well, Americans think they're on American soil. And so when Polk goes back to Congress, he says that Mexico is invading the U.S., and Congress believed the idea that the United States troops were actually under attack. And so war is declared here because of this confusion over what the actual battle was. Now, the war lasts about 3 years. And it's pretty bloody, but America has many benefits when the war started. Even though their army isn't that big, they end up recruiting 60,000 volunteers very, very quickly. American Navy is also way stronger, as you can see here. Right, Americans are able to sail all through the Gulf of Mexico as well as through the Pacific, and basically attack ports and blockade them. The government is stable. There's good leadership in the American military at this time. And the economy and morale is better as well for U.S. troops. So, in a nutshell, this is a rout of the Mexicans. And we have 4 major military commanders that we need to talk about that kind of, earn their glory during this conflict. And one will even become president later on. First is John Fremont. Fremont, of course, goes from Fort Leavenworth in modern-day Kansas all the way out here, all the way out to California. And he beats the Mexicans in California and sets up what is known as a Bear Flag Republic, right? Another kind of independent nation status for California, which will become a U.S. state. Stephen Kearny is going to be sent to New Mexico, also traveling to Bent's Fort, and goes down. He takes Santa Fe relatively easily, in fact, so easily that the United States troops have no casualties. And after that, he's going to march on the southern route to join Fremont in the southern port towns of California. Third is Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor is the one, of course, that provokes the Mexicans by crossing the border. He crossed the Rio Grande and fights Santa Anna towards the heart of Mexico, which would be these conflicts in Monterey and Buena Vista. And lastly is Winfield Scott, nicknamed Old Fussin' Feathers, which is a great nickname, by the way. And Winfield Scott is going to sail from New Orleans and attack the eastern coast of Mexico. And actually, kind of by sailing down the eastern coast, ends up attacking Mexico City. There's a pitched battle in 1847 in Mexico City. So not only do the United States rout the Mexicans in disputed territory in what is known as a Great Basin, that includes the modern day states of Nevada, Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico, but he actually is able to sail all the way down into Mexico and attack Mexico City. Now, the Whigs, this other political party, is very much against the war. They said that Polk's methods were misleading and unconstitutional, and abolitionists, which of course are on the rise here, are worried about the fact that all of this territory down here, right, can be made into slave states. And so, this war, even though it's kind of a rout, and many Americans support it because of the concepts of manifest destiny and expansion, it's also harshly criticized by many Americans, including Henry David Thoreau, which of course is actually thrown into jail as a result of not paying his taxes. He didn't want to support this war, which is seen basically as a land grab, and it kind of was. Now, at the end of the war, after the Americans win, they sign what is known as a Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. All right, if you want spelling, I'll go ahead and highlight it. Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, one of the great treaties in American history, one of the great names of American treaties. And basically what happens here is all of New Mexico, all of the disputed Texas territory, and California will go to the United States, which is initially what the U.S. wanted, and then the Mexican government was paid $15 million. Okay, Mexico, as a result of this war, loses half of her territory, half of it, half of the land that was previously Mexican, and basically will never get it back, of course. And it's kind of a mark that the United States is going to be stronger, and the idea of manifest destiny will not be stopped. After the conclusion of the Mexican-American War, there's going to be a massive influx of migration westward into California. And this is going to be driven by a group of Americans known as the 49ers, right? Of course, of whom the San Francisco 49ers is named, right? Well, who are they? Well, they're young male migrants searching to strike it rich in mining towns in California, right? And here's a great website, by the way, California Mining Towns on the westernmininghistory.com website. It'd be cool. You can click on some of these and see what their history was. There's Eureka, which means, of course, I found it, right? The early pictures of these mining towns. Anyway, the mining towns end up getting about 80,000 immigrants, and they're trying to strike it rich quickly in California. 95% of these migrants are young and male, mostly an idle population. They are not necessarily the people you would associate settling down and starting a family and opening up a business or grinding it out in the Eastern factory. They come out here to strike it rich and to get money quickly. Life in mining towns is lawless. Of course, a lot of the stereotypes you might associate with living out there, such as gambling, fighting, and drinking, are very common. There are next to no females that are out there at all. About 20% of the females who do live out there are actually prostitutes. So, living in a western mining town was a pretty tenuous existence. Most do not strike it rich. Don't think that most of the young men who came out were made all sorts of money and they opened up a prospecting camp and they struck gold and they all walked out of there as millionaires. In fact, very, very, very few made it at all. And most of these mining towns, like Eureka here, are going to turn into ghost towns. Okay, and ghost towns basically form when a mine is exhausted, all of its ore is extracted, or it was a hoax to begin with. It's considered a bust. Eureka will be one of those areas. And I just think this is fascinating stuff. But ghost towns just, for some reason, fascinate me to no end. You can still go to some of them actually today. They're of course being more protected, but I know when I live in Colorado, I went to the Bluebird mine, Blue Jay mine, which was up in Colorado, just outside of Boulder, and it was very well preserved. You could see the old mining quarters, the old shafts and all that sort of stuff, and it's just completely abandoned now. Anyway, pretty fascinating stuff. Now, you might think that the only people who are coming out to these mines are going to be white Americans, and that's simply not true. In fact, California, from its very beginning, was a very diverse community. Many free African Americans, Mexicans, Chinese, and German Jewish immigrants are going to move to California once again to make money. There are actually 45,000 immigrants in the California gold rush between 1849 and 1854. Now, whites didn't necessarily accept them with open arms. In fact, there were usually violent clashes against other minorities. Not to mention that Native Americans are moved off their lands ruthlessly as soon as gold is discovered. So, this Western mining boom, of course, is going to establish, in the long run, governmental structures and new statehoods for some of these big states. Colorado, South Dakota, Nevada, all of these states will have their own gold rushes. And it leads to opportunities, of course, but it also leads to ruthlessness, not only against Native Americans, but against these mining towns, the neighbors of people living against each other. Ethnic and racial discrimination will be the norms out here. All right, that is going to be it for chapter 29. Enjoy your questions. If you have any other questions, feel free to email me or just talk to me in class. Thanks so much.